My son stole my safe at 11:47 on a Thursday night. At 8:06 the next morning, he called to check on me. That's the strange thing about betrayal. The person who hurts you most is often the same person asking if you're okay. Stay with me here because what Mason Ward didn't know was that my doorbell camera recorded everything. And what he knew even less was that I'd spent 30 years building a career around catching people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Before we get into the story, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. We've got plenty more real-life family drama, hard-earned lessons, and stories that remind us how complicated family can be. The truth is, if you'd driven past my house on West Irene Street in Boise, Idaho, 2 weeks before all of this happened, you never would have guessed there was a family disaster quietly warming up inside it. You would have seen an ordinary one-story brick house with a faded American flag hanging from the porch. You would have seen an old blue Ford F-150 parked in the driveway. You probably would have seen me sitting on the front porch with a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Grandpa," even though I wasn't actually a grandpa. That mug had been a joke gift from my wife Evelyn 15 years ago. I kept using it because she would have laughed at that. And when you've been widowed for 5 years, sometimes laughter becomes something you preserve like old photographs. My name is Cannon Ward. I'm 68 years old, retired, mostly. The official story is that I retired from insurance investigations in 2019. The unofficial story is that old habits don't retire. They just become hobbies. For more than 3 decades, I worked insurance fraud and theft investigations throughout Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. When a business claimed equipment disappeared, when a warehouse mysteriously burned down right before bankruptcy, when a contractor reported stolen tools that somehow showed up at his brother-in-law's house, people called me. My job wasn't glamorous, no car chases, no dramatic interrogations, mostly paperwork, video footage, receipts, human behavior. I learned something valuable during those years. People lie, but details don't. A liar can remember a story. It's much harder to remember every detail supporting that story. That's usually where things fall apart. Back then, I spent thousands of hours watching security footage, frame by frame, minute by minute, looking for the moment someone thought nobody was watching. Funny enough, that experience would become important again. I just didn't know it yet. After Evelyn passed away from pancreatic cancer, life became quieter. Not bad, just quieter. There's a difference. A lot of people assume older folks spend their days feeling lonely. Sometimes we do, but mostly we learn how to live with silence. I had routines. Every morning at 6:15, I woke up without an alarm. At 6:30, coffee. Black. No sugar. At 7 o'clock, I filled the bird feeders in the backyard. At 8 o'clock, I usually drove down to Goldie's for breakfast or stopped by Moxie Java. Simple life. Predictable life. The kind of life I thought I'd earned. One of the few people who regularly interrupted that routine was my neighbor Linda Harper. Now Linda deserves her own documentary. She was 67 years old, retired elementary school principal, 5'2", approximately 5'8" when angry, which was often. Linda had been Evelyn's best friend for almost 30 years. After Evelyn died, Linda sort of adopted me. Not officially, just aggressively. Every few days she'd appear on my porch carrying banana bread, apple pie soup cookies, or some other homemade item I absolutely did not need. Then she'd stand there waiting. "You gonna invite me in, Cannon, or am I conducting this conversation from the sidewalk?" That was Linda. Nobody argued with Linda. Not successfully. 3 weeks before the safe disappeared, she showed up with banana bread and found me cleaning out a storage closet. "You're organizing again," she said. "That's what retired investigators do." No, that's what anxious retired investigators do. She wasn't entirely wrong. The closet contained paperwork, old photographs, tax records, insurance files, and the contents of a heavy gray safe that sat in my home office. That safe would eventually become the center of this story. But here's something important. The safe wasn't valuable for the reason most people would assume. There wasn't gold inside, no stacks of cash, no hidden fortune. In fact, if a thief had opened it expecting treasure, disappointment would have arrived quickly. Inside were folders, documents, external hard drives, insurance records, property files, a few family keepsakes, and something far more important than money: letters. Hundreds of them. Letters Evelyn had written during the final year of her illness. Letters for birthdays she knew she'd miss. Letters for anniversaries. Letters for difficult days. Letters for good days. Letters she wanted me to read when life became complicated. Those letters mattered more to me than every dollar I'd ever earned. I need you to understand that. Because later, when people ask why I was upset about the safe, it wasn't because of financial value. It was because memories were inside it. Pieces of my wife. Pieces of our life. Things that couldn't be replaced. At least that's what I thought at the time. The safe also contained backup drives. Now this next part matters. Years earlier, because of my investigative background, I'd developed a habit. I backed up everything: documents, photos, videos, legal paperwork. Everything existed in multiple locations. Friends used to tease me about it. Linda called it professional paranoia. I called it preparation. Preparation had saved me more than once during my career. It turns out it would save me again. Around that same time, my son Mason started appearing more often. At first, I was happy. Honestly, happy. Because before that, our relationship had become distant. Not hostile, just distant. Life happened. Work, schedules, priorities. Months could pass between visits. Then suddenly Mason was showing up every week, sometimes twice a week. He'd bring coffee, help with yard work, ask about my health, offer to fix things around the house. The first few times I appreciated it. The fourth or fifth time, I became curious. You know that feeling, when something seems positive but doesn't quite fit, like finding snow in July. Not impossible, just unusual. Mason wasn't acting like himself. And because I'd spent 30 years studying behavior, unusual things tend to get my attention. One afternoon, he was helping me replace a loose porch railing, 72 degrees, clear Idaho sky, country music playing softly from my garage radio. Out of nowhere, he asked a question. "Hey, Dad, you still keep important documents in that safe?" The question wasn't alarming, not by itself, but it landed strangely. I shrugged. "Some." He nodded. Then he asked another. "What kind of documents?" I looked at him. He looked away first. That caught my attention. Not enough to accuse him of anything, not even close, just enough to notice. And once I noticed, I started noticing more. The questions became more frequent, more specific, about property records, about insurance policies, about wills, about account information, small questions, reasonable questions. But together, they formed a pattern. And patterns are difficult for former investigators to ignore. At the time, I still wanted to believe the best. After all, he was my son. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small warning light had started blinking. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to remind me to pay attention. And over the next few days, that warning light would become impossible to ignore. The first time I seriously wondered whether something was wrong with Mason happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't say. People think deception is always about lies. It isn't. A lot of the time, it's about omissions. The missing pieces tell you more than the story itself. Mason pulled into my driveway around 3 o'clock in his black BMW X5. Brand new. Or at least new enough to still have temporary dealership tags. Now, I don't normally pay attention to things like that. A man wants to buy a nice vehicle. That's his business. But I happen to know the Boise real estate market hadn't been especially kind lately. Interest rates were climbing, sales were slowing. Several agents I knew had been struggling, yet somehow Mason kept upgrading his lifestyle. New SUV, new watch, weekend trips, expensive restaurants. The math wasn't quite adding up. Again, not proof of anything. Just another small detail. And details have a way of accumulating. He walked into the house carrying 2 coffees. "Thought I'd surprise you." I laughed. "You're either being thoughtful or guilty." He grinned. "Can't it be both?" At the time, it sounded like a joke. Later, it didn't. We sat at the kitchen table. Same table where Evelyn and I had spent nearly 40 years drinking coffee, paying bills, and arguing about whether tomatoes belonged in the refrigerator. For the record, they don't. Evelyn was wrong about that. I know she's probably winning that argument somewhere from beyond the grave, but facts are facts. Anyway. Mason looked tired, really tired. There were dark circles under his eyes. His smile seemed forced. His energy felt off. For a few minutes, we talked normally. Football. Weather. A neighbor who had somehow managed to drive into his own mailbox. Then the conversation shifted. Not suddenly. Gradually. Like a car changing lanes without signaling. So how's retirement treating you these days? Pretty good. You still managing all your finances yourself? There it was. Another one. Small. Harmless on the surface, but familiar. I shrugged. Sure. No advisor. Nope. No trust manager. I smiled. You planning to rob me, son? He laughed, a little too loudly. That caught my attention. Again. I was just asking. I know. The conversation moved on, at least on the surface. Inside my head, though, I was filing things away. That's another habit I never lost. During investigations, I'd keep mental folders, interesting details, contradictions, behavioral shifts. Nothing dramatic, just observations. By that evening, Mason had unknowingly added several more. A week later, things became harder to ignore. I met Linda for breakfast at Goldie's. As usual, she arrived 5 minutes early. As usual, she had opinions, lots of opinions. The moment she sat down, she pointed at me with a fork. I don't trust him. I nearly dropped my coffee. Good morning to you too. I'm serious. About who? Mason. I sighed. Linda. What? That's my son. I know exactly who he is. I rubbed my forehead. Why don't you trust him? She leaned forward. Now, when Linda leaned forward, you paid attention. That's how principals survive 30 years managing children. And parents. Mostly parents. Because he's acting like a man trying to remember lines from a play. I stared at her. That was disturbingly close to my own impression. What do you mean? She lowered her voice. I mean, every conversation sounds rehearsed. I hated how accurate that sounded. Because I had noticed it too. Questions. Specific questions. Questions that always seem to drift toward assets, property, documents, accounts, insurance, the safe. Always the safe. Especially the safe. I still hadn't confronted him. Partly because I had no evidence. Partly because I didn't want to believe it. And if you've ever been a parent, you understand that feeling. You can recognize a problem before you're emotionally ready to admit it exists. The next red flag appeared 3 days later. Mason came over to help me clean the garage. At least that was the official reason. We spent about an hour sorting old boxes. Most of them contained things nobody needed. Old extension cords, Christmas decorations, power tools, half-finished projects. Retirement creates a surprising number of half-finished projects. Around noon, I went inside to make sandwiches. When I came back out, Mason was standing near my office door. The office happened to be where the safe was located. He immediately stepped away. Too quickly. You know that look? The look people get when they've been caught doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. His face flashed it for less than a second. Then it disappeared. But I saw it. And once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. What are you doing? I asked casually. Nothing. That answer arrived too fast. Nobody says nothing that quickly unless they've already prepared it. I nodded. Didn't push. Didn't accuse. Didn't react. Another lesson from investigations. The moment people realize you're suspicious, they become careful. Careful people make fewer mistakes. I preferred mistakes, so I let it go. Or at least I pretended to. That evening, after Mason left, I walked into the office. The safe looked untouched. Nothing appeared missing. Nothing appeared damaged. Still, I checked everything. Old habit, the letters, the hard drives, the documents. Everything was there. Yet the feeling remained. That uneasy feeling in your stomach. Not fear, not exactly. More like anticipation, like watching dark clouds gather on the horizon. You don't know when the storm will arrive, but you know it's coming. The following Sunday, things finally started making sense. Not because of something Mason did, because of something someone else said. I was standing outside after church when I ran into a man named Greg Hollister. Greg owned a mortgage company downtown. We chatted for a few minutes, then he casually mentioned Mason. Hope your boy's doing okay. I frowned. What do you mean? Greg immediately looked uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable people get when they realize they've accidentally revealed information. Nothing. That word again. Nothing. The most suspicious word in the English language. I smiled politely. Greg. He hesitated, then sighed. I probably shouldn't say anything. Then definitely say it. He laughed. For a moment. Then his expression changed. I heard he's carrying a lot more debt than people realize. My stomach tightened. Not because debt is unusual, because secrecy is. Greg continued. Commercial property deal went sideways earlier this year. That was news to me. A few investors lost money. More news. Mason took a pretty big hit. I thanked him and changed the subject. But internally, pieces began moving. Suddenly, the expensive SUV made more sense. The questions made more sense. The increased visits made more sense. The interest in my finances made more sense. None of it proved anything. But it created a possible motive. And motives matter. I drove home feeling unsettled. Not angry. Not yet. Mostly sad. Because if my suspicions were right, then my son wasn't visiting because he missed me. He was visiting because he needed something. Maybe money. Maybe security. Maybe access. I didn't know. What I did know was that the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. And then Thursday night arrived. The night everything changed. The night a motion alert appeared on my phone at exactly 11:47 p.m. And the moment I opened that camera feed, every question I'd been asking suddenly had an answer. I was asleep when the motion alert came through. Not deeply asleep. At 68, I don't think I've experienced truly deep sleep since sometime around the Clinton administration. It was Thursday, September 28th, 11:47 p.m. I remember because the timestamp is burned into my memory. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand. Normally, I would have ignored it. Doorbell cameras pick up everything. Cats, raccoons, teenagers making bad decisions. One memorable occasion involved a man dressed as Elvis chasing a loose goat down the street. I still have that video somewhere, but something made me look. Maybe instinct. Maybe luck. Maybe 30 years of training my brain to pay attention when something felt off. Whatever it was, I grabbed the phone. The screen lit up. Motion detected. Front porch. I tapped the notification. And for a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. You know those moments when reality and expectation collide? When your mind says, that can't be right. That's exactly what happened. Because standing on my porch was my son, Mason, and beside him was Ethan Cole. I recognized him immediately. Ethan was one of Mason's oldest friends. They'd known each other since high school, football teammates, fishing buddies, the kind of friendship that survives bad haircuts, bad decisions, and bad marriages. The camera angle showed both of them struggling with something heavy, very heavy. Then they stepped sideways, and the object came into view. My safe, my gray Liberty safe, 480 pounds of steel, the safe that had been sitting in my office for years. The safe that absolutely should not have been outside. For a few seconds, I simply stared. Not moving, not breathing, not thinking, just staring. Because no matter how suspicious I'd become, I had never actually expected this. Suspicion is one thing. Confirmation is something else entirely. The video continued. Mason wore a gray hoodie, dark jeans, work gloves. Ethan wore a black jacket and Boise State baseball cap. Together, they wrestled the safe down a plywood ramp toward a black Chevrolet Silverado parked in my driveway. The truck's tailgate was already down. Prepared. Planned. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't panic. This wasn't a mistake. This was a project. A project my son had apparently spent time organizing. That realization hurt more than the theft itself. Because planning requires intention, and intention requires choices. Lots of choices. Mason had made every one of them. I watched Ethan slip slightly on the driveway. The safe tilted. For one terrifying second, I thought it might crush his foot. Instead, it slammed against the truck bed. The sound echoed through the camera microphone. Metal against metal. Heavy. Violent. Final. I replayed the clip. Then again. Then again. Not because I doubted what I'd seen, because I was studying it. Old habits. Investigators don't watch events, they analyze them. I slowed the footage, frame by frame. Mason looked nervous. Ethan looked frustrated. Neither one looked particularly skilled. Honestly, if there had been an Olympic event for stealing safes, these two would have finished somewhere behind the countries that forgot to show up. And that's where the first mistake appeared. Actually, several mistakes. The first was obvious. They came through my front porch, directly in front of the camera. Most people assume criminals think about cameras. Many don't, especially when they believe they belong there. Mason wasn't acting like a burglar. He was acting like a son. And sons often forget their fathers notice things. The second mistake was even better. The Silverado's license plate was visible, perfectly visible. The porch light illuminated it beautifully. I almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny, because the universe occasionally enjoys irony. The third mistake arrived a few moments later. As they loaded the safe, Mason removed one glove. Just one. For maybe 5 seconds. Long enough to wipe sweat from his forehead. Long enough for the camera to capture his face clearly. No ambiguity, no uncertainty. No mistaken identity. Just Mason, my son, stealing from me. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in my hand, heart pounding. The logical part of my brain immediately began building options. Call the police, call Mason, drive outside, confront them, do something, anything. The emotional part wanted something different. It wanted answers. Why? That single word kept repeating in my head. Why? Why not ask for help? Why not talk to me? Why not be honest? I wish I could tell you I was furious. Hollywood would probably prefer that version. The angry father, the explosive confrontation, the dramatic chase. But the truth is I mostly felt tired and disappointed, because betrayal from strangers feels different. When strangers hurt you, they damage your trust. When family hurts you, they damage your memories. Suddenly, every recent conversation with Mason replayed in my mind. Every question, every visit, every suspicious glance toward the office, every carefully worded inquiry about documents, each piece slid into place. The picture became clear. And I hated the picture. I checked the live feed. The truck was gone. Driveway empty. House silent, as if none of it had happened. But it had. And now I had to decide what came next. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, then another, then another. At midnight, I sat at the dining room table where Evelyn and I used to play cards. I found myself staring at her photograph. Funny how grief works. Even years later, your first instinct is still to talk to the person who's gone. Evelyn, I said quietly, you're not going to like this. The photograph offered no advice. Very unhelpful. Though if she had been there, she probably would have said exactly what Linda would later tell me. Don't react emotionally. Think first. I spent the next hour reviewing footage, not just from my camera. Every angle available. Front porch, driveway, side yard. Timestamps, movements, vehicle arrival, vehicle departure. A timeline began forming naturally. 11:31 p.m. Silverado arrives. 11:35 p.m. Garage side gate opens. 11:42 p.m. Safe appears. 11:47 p.m. Safe loaded. 11:51 p.m. Truck leaves. Simple. Clean. Documented. At 1:07 a.m. I finally went back to bed. Not because I was calm, because I had made a decision. I wasn't calling the police. Not yet. Pay attention to this next part. That decision wasn't weakness, it wasn't denial, and it definitely wasn't forgiveness. It was strategy. Because years of investigations taught me something important. The first evidence you find is rarely the most valuable evidence. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is wait. Let people keep moving. Let them keep talking. Let them believe they've succeeded. Greedy people become careless when they think they've won. And if Mason truly believed he had gotten away with it, he was about to become very careless. I fell asleep sometime after 2 in the morning. Then, at exactly 8:06 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID said Mason Ward. I stared at the screen for 3 full seconds before answering. And when I finally picked up, my son sounded like the most concerned man in Idaho. I let the phone ring twice before answering, not because I needed time to think. I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I needed time to sound normal. That's different. If you've ever had someone lie directly to your face while you already knew the truth, then you understand the challenge. The hardest part isn't discovering the lie. The hardest part is pretending you haven't. Finally, I answered. Morning, Mason. His voice came through immediately, warm, concerned, almost cheerful. Hey, Dad. Sorry if I woke you. You know that voice people use when they're trying very hard to sound casual. That voice. I looked out the kitchen window toward the empty driveway, the same driveway where he'd loaded my safe less than 9 hours earlier. Nope, I said. Been up a while. Good, good. A brief pause followed, too brief to notice normally, long enough for me to notice. Then came the question, the reason for the call. How are you doing today? There it was. The performance, the opening line, the script. I leaned against the counter. Doing okay? Everything all right at the house? Another question. Very specific, not how are you, not how's your morning. Everything all right at the house? Interesting. Very interesting. Seems fine. A longer pause this time. I could practically hear him thinking, trying to determine whether I knew, trying to decide how much information to gather, trying to measure risk. Meanwhile, I was standing in my kitchen wearing flannel pajama pants and pretending to be the least suspicious man in Idaho. Good, he finally said. You sound relieved. A nervous laugh. What? You sound relieved. Another pause. That one lasted almost 3 seconds, long enough to become uncomfortable. Then he laughed again, too loudly. Again. I guess I just worry about you. I nearly admired the commitment. Nearly. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee. That's nice of you. The conversation drifted for several minutes. Work, weather, football, normal topics. But underneath every word, something else was happening. Mason was probing, testing, searching, and I was letting him, because the more comfortable he became, the more likely he was to make mistakes. Finally, he asked the question he'd really called to ask. So, Dad, there it was. I waited. The safe still working? Okay. I almost laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because subtlety had apparently left the building. The safe? Yeah. I let silence hang there for a second. Not too long, just enough. Seems to be. Another pause. This one felt heavier, almost disappointed, as though he had expected a different answer, as though he'd hoped I had already discovered something, or perhaps hoped I hadn't. Either way, he was fishing, and he wasn't catching anything. Good, he said. Then he quickly changed subjects. Too quickly. People do that when they accidentally step too close to something dangerous. The conversation ended a few minutes later. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen staring at my phone. The house felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of silence that follows disappointment. Then the doorbell rang. I looked at the clock. 8:42 a.m., right on schedule. Linda Harper. Of course. I opened the door. She stood there holding a loaf of banana bread wrapped in aluminum foil. I swear that woman possessed some kind of baked goods radar. Major emotional events somehow triggered banana bread production. Morning, she said. I stepped aside. She walked in, then immediately stopped. Her eyes narrowed. Cannon. Uh-oh. That tone. I knew that tone. What? She pointed at me. What's wrong? I sighed. Nothing. She folded her arms. That's investigator language. What does that mean? It means something is absolutely wrong. I laughed despite myself. She wasn't wrong. Linda walked into the kitchen and placed the banana bread on the counter. Then she turned toward me. Talk. About what? Cannon. I sighed again. She waited. Patiently. Relentlessly. Like a shark. Eventually I gave up. Not everything, just enough. Mason called. Her eyebrows lifted. And it was strange. When is it not strange? Fair point. I sat down, told her about the call. Not the video. Not yet. Just the call. The questions, the weird pauses, the concern that sounded manufactured. Linda listened quietly. When I finished, she nodded. Something's wrong. I know. Do you think he's in trouble? That question lingered, because the answer was yes. I absolutely thought he was in trouble. The problem was that I suspected he had chosen the wrong solution, and those are two very different things. I think he's desperate, I said. Linda looked sad. Not angry, sad. Because she'd known Mason almost his entire life. She attended his high school graduation. She'd brought casseroles after his divorce. She'd celebrated birthdays and holidays with our family. His failure would hurt her too. Not the same way, but it would still hurt. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Linda sliced the banana bread. And because life is strange, I found myself discussing felony theft while eating exceptionally good banana bread. If you've never experienced that combination, I can't recommend it. Around 10 o'clock after Linda left, I finally walked into my office. The empty corner where the safe had stood looked wrong, like a missing tooth. The carpet still showed compression marks from the safe's weight. Dust outlined its former shape. Evidence, more evidence, everywhere. I stared at the empty space. Then I remembered something. A conversation from several months earlier, one Mason had probably forgotten. During my career, I'd occasionally spoken at fraud prevention seminars, businesses, insurance groups, security conferences. One topic came up repeatedly: redundancy. Never trust a single layer of protection. Never assume a safe is enough. Never assume a lock is enough. Never assume a password is enough. Build backups, layers, contingencies. Mason knew I believed that, but he didn't know how seriously I took it, and he certainly didn't know everything I'd done with that particular safe. I smiled. For the first time since discovering the theft. Not because I was happy, because a piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. You see, years earlier, after someone stole several $1,000s worth of tools from a job site I was investigating, I developed a habit, a very specific habit, one that seemed paranoid at the time, one that now seemed extremely useful. I walked over to my desk, opened a drawer, pulled out a small notebook. Inside were records, dates, serial numbers, equipment information, backup information. And one particular entry made me smile again. A smile that would have worried anyone watching, because it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just realized his opponent was playing a game without knowing all the rules. Pay attention to this next part. Mason thought he had stolen leverage. What he had actually stolen was a tracking device. And if that device was still active, then somewhere in Boise, my safe was quietly telling me exactly where it had been taken. I should probably explain the tracking device before this starts sounding ridiculous. Because if somebody told me a stolen safe was secretly broadcasting its location, I'd have questions too. Years earlier, while investigating a series of commercial theft claims, I'd learned something interesting. Professional thieves often target the obvious valuables: cash, jewelry, equipment, safes. What they don't expect is for the safe itself to become evidence. That lesson stuck with me. So when I purchased my Liberty safe back in 2016, I made a small modification. Nothing fancy, nothing out of a spy movie, just a compact battery-powered tracking device hidden behind an interior panel, the kind used by construction companies to recover stolen equipment. The battery lasted years. Most people never would have found it. Honestly, I sometimes forgot it was there myself. Until that Thursday night. Now suddenly it seemed like the best decision I'd made in a decade. I opened the notebook, found the tracker information, serial number, activation code, login credentials, everything neatly recorded, because that's how retired investigators entertain themselves. We make spreadsheets. It's not glamorous. At 10:37 that morning, I logged into the tracking account. My hands were surprisingly steady. I expected anxiety. Instead, I felt focused. The same feeling I'd experienced hundreds of times during investigations. The facts existed. My job was simply to find them. The screen loaded. Then a map appeared. A blinking dot. I stared at it. Once, twice, 3 times. Then I zoomed in. Garden City, just west of Boise, near an industrial section filled with warehouses and storage facilities. Interesting. Very interesting. I zoomed further. The dot settled on a location near Chinden Boulevard, a self-storage complex. Well, that didn't take long. I leaned back in my chair. The tracker wasn't just active. It was practically waving at me. For the first time since discovering the theft, certainty replaced suspicion. The safe had been moved. The safe was there. And someone had been careless enough to keep it there. Greed does that. People become so focused on possession that they stop thinking about consequences. I called the one person I trusted to think clearly about evidence. Ray Mitchell, retired Boise police lieutenant, 71 years old, stubborn, sharp, and possibly the only man I knew who organized his garage more obsessively than I did. Ray answered on the second ring. Cannon. Morning. If you're calling before lunch, something's wrong. Apparently everyone in my life had become alarmingly good at reading me. Need your opinion? That's usually expensive. I laughed. Coffee. Now you're talking. An hour later, Ray sat across from me at the kitchen table, coffee mug in hand, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. I showed him the video, all of it. For the first time since this started, someone else saw exactly what I'd seen. Ray watched silently, no interruptions, no reactions, just observation. The video ended. He replayed it. Then again. Finally, he removed his glasses. That's Mason. Yep. Not much room for interpretation. Nope. Ray sighed, the kind of sigh old men make when they're disappointed in younger generations. That's rough. It was. Coming from anyone else, those words would have sounded generic. Coming from Ray, they carried weight, because he understood exactly what the footage meant. Not legally, emotionally. What's your plan? He asked. I showed him the tracker location. That got his attention. His eyebrows lifted. Well, that's convenient. That's one word for it. We spent the next hour doing what old investigators do best, building timelines, testing assumptions, looking for weaknesses, looking for evidence, looking for mistakes, and there were already several. The first problem for Mason was obvious, the video. The second problem was the tracker. The third problem emerged when Ray suggested something simple. Check neighboring cameras. I smiled. Already done. The night before, after discovering the theft, I'd remembered that 3 houses on my street used Ring cameras, one directly across the road, one next door, one near the corner. By noon, I had politely contacted all 3 neighbors. Retirement has advantages. People trust friendly old men asking reasonable questions. 2 neighbors responded almost immediately. One sent footage. The other invited me over to review recordings. By late afternoon, the timeline became even stronger. Camera 1 showed the Silverado arriving. Camera 2 captured it leaving. Camera 3 captured the truck turning onto Harrison Boulevard. Different angles, different timestamps. Same story. The evidence was stacking up. And the higher the stack grew, the calmer I became. That's another thing people misunderstand about investigations. Good evidence reduces emotion. You stop arguing about what happened. You start documenting it. Around 3 o'clock, Linda appeared. Again. This time carrying apple pie. I swear that woman operated an emotional support bakery. She walked into the kitchen, saw Ray, saw my laptop, saw the paused video frame, and immediately understood something serious was happening. Her eyes narrowed. What did he do? Ray and I exchanged a glance. I sighed, then I showed her. The footage. Every second. When it finished, Linda simply stared at the screen. No words, no movement, nothing. Then she whispered, "Oh, Mason." Not angry, not shocked, heartbroken. That somehow felt worse, because disappointment hurts longer than anger. She sat down slowly. I don't understand. Neither did I, at least not completely. I understood debt, I understood pressure, I understood fear. What I didn't understand was why he hadn't come to me. I would have helped, not with unlimited money, but with honesty, with solutions, with support. Instead, he'd chosen deception, and deception always creates collateral damage. Linda eventually looked at me. What are you going to do? That question had been hanging over everything. What was I going to do? Call police, confront Mason, retrieve the safe. expose him immediately. All options remained available, but none felt right. Not yet, because there was still information missing, and missing information bothers investigators. A lot. Around 4:30, I checked the tracker again. The dot hadn't moved. Same storage facility, same location. Interesting, very interesting. Because if Mason had already opened the safe, I would have expected movement, activity, something. Instead, it sat there, waiting, which suggested one of two possibilities. Either he hadn't opened it yet, or he couldn't. The second possibility made me smile. You see, the safe wasn't easy to access. It required a combination only I knew. And while the safe could eventually be forced open, that process required time. Tools, noise, planning, things desperate people often struggle with. As evening approached, another thought occurred to me, one that felt increasingly likely. Mason hadn't stolen the safe for sentimental documents. He hadn't stolen it for family photographs. He hadn't stolen it for Evelyn's letters. He probably believed something else was inside, something valuable, something liquid, something he could use quickly. Money, property records, account access. Whatever he expected disappointment was probably waiting for him. And disappointed people often make mistakes, big mistakes. The kind of mistakes that create even more evidence. That night, just before bed, I checked the tracker one final time. Still there. Still broadcasting. Still quietly betraying the people who thought they were in control. I set my phone on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and smiled in the darkness. Because while Mason believed he had taken my leverage, the truth was exactly the opposite. He was driving straight toward a trap he didn't even know existed. And somewhere inside that storage unit, reality was waiting for him. The first sign that things weren't going according to Mason's plan arrived 3 days later. On Monday morning, 9:14 a.m. Not that I was counting. Okay, I was absolutely counting. When you've spent 30 years investigating people, patience becomes less about waiting and more about observation. I wasn't sitting around doing nothing. I was watching, tracking, listening, and most importantly, allowing Mason enough room to create his own problems. Because greedy people rarely need help destroying themselves. They usually handle that part alone. Monday started quietly. Coffee, bird feeders. A brief conversation with Linda about whether Idaho drivers had become worse or whether we were simply older and less tolerant. The answer was probably both. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A text message from Mason. Short, simple, unexpected. Need to talk. Call me when you get a chance. Interesting. Very interesting. For nearly 2 weeks, Mason had been carefully managing every interaction. Calm, controlled, measured. Now suddenly, there was urgency. That told me something. Pressure was increasing. I waited 30 minutes before responding. Not because I was playing games, because desperate people reveal more when they have time to worry. At 9:47, I called. He answered immediately. Too immediately. Almost as if he'd been staring at his phone. "Hey, Dad." His voice sounded different. Less confident, less polished. Good. That meant reality was starting to catch up with him. "Morning. You busy?" "Not particularly." A pause. Then, "I wanted to ask you something." There it was. The real reason. Finally. I leaned back in my chair. "Go ahead." Another pause. Longer this time. Then Mason said something that nearly made me laugh. "Do you still remember the combination to your safe?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched. Not awkward. Dangerous. Because that single question told me everything. He hadn't opened it. Not yet. And judging from his tone, he'd already tried. Probably several times. Probably unsuccessfully. I looked out the window toward the backyard, trying very hard not to sound amused. Why? Another pause. A big one. Then came the lie. I was just curious. Of course he was, the same way a shark is curious about seals. I remember it. Good. Why? No reason. There it was again. No reason? The second most suspicious phrase in the English language, right behind nothing. I smiled. You know, Mason, curiosity usually follows a question. He laughed nervously, then changed subjects. Again. That was becoming a habit. The conversation ended a few minutes later, but one thing had become obvious. Whatever Mason expected to find inside the safe, he hadn't found it. And that was creating problems. For him, not for me. By Wednesday, those problems had grown significantly. I learned that from a source Mason never would have expected. Ethan Cole. Indirectly, of course. Not because Ethan suddenly became honest, because desperate people talk, and information travels. Ray happened to know someone who worked at the storage facility. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, small-town networking. The sort of thing that naturally happens when people spend decades living in the same city. According to that source, 2 men had visited the storage unit repeatedly over several days. One frustrated, one angry. One of them apparently yelling, several times. I think we can all guess which one was Mason. The image almost made me smile. Almost. Because underneath everything, there was still sadness. Every piece of evidence confirmed the same reality. My son wasn't making a mistake, he was making choices. There's a difference. A painful difference. Thursday afternoon, another text arrived. This one wasn't subtle. Need your help with something important. Now we were getting somewhere. I called. Again, he answered immediately. What's going on? I asked. A long exhale. Then, I'm dealing with a cash flow issue. Cash flow issue. That sounded much nicer than financial disaster. People are funny that way. We rename problems hoping they'll hurt less. What kind of issue? Another pause. Then pieces of the truth finally began appearing. A commercial development investment, a failed property deal, private investors, missed payments, mounting debt, pressure. A lot of pressure. Not the full truth, but more truth than I'd heard before. I listened quietly, and for the first time since this began, I genuinely felt sorry for him. Not because he'd stolen from me, because he was drowning. And drowning people don't always think clearly. That doesn't excuse their actions, but it helps explain them. There's a difference between understanding and forgiving. Many people confuse the two. Eventually, Mason reached the real point. I might need help. There it was, the sentence he should have spoken weeks ago, maybe months ago. The sentence that could have prevented everything. I closed my eyes, imagining an alternate version of the story. One where he sat at my kitchen table, told the truth, asked for advice, asked for help, trusted me, instead of stealing from me. That version would have ended differently, but we weren't living in that version anymore. We were living in this one, and this one involved evidence, trackers, video footage, storage units. So what exactly are you asking? I said. Another pause. Then, I was wondering if you'd consider using the house as collateral. There it was, the real goal, the destination, the reason behind every question about paperwork, every question about property, every question about the safe. He wanted leverage, financial leverage, and he believed I was his solution. My stomach tightened, not from surprise, from confirmation, because hearing a fear become reality always hurts, even when you expected it. I'll think about it. The relief in his voice was immediate, too immediate. He thought progress had been made. He thought he was getting closer. What he didn't realize was that I was learning far more than he was. The following morning brought the biggest mistake yet, the one that shifted everything, the one greed created. At 8:22 a.m., my phone buzzed again. A text. From Mason. Except it wasn't intended for me. It was intended for Ethan. He'd accidentally sent it to the wrong conversation. I stared at the screen, read it twice, then a third time. The message said, if he won't cooperate, we'll have to pressure him harder. That was it. One sentence. No context. No explanation. But context wasn't necessary, because context already existed. Video footage. Theft. Storage units. Financial desperation. And now this. Pressure him harder. I sat quietly for a long time after reading it. Not angry, not shocked, just disappointed. Again. Because that message represented a line, and Mason had crossed it. He wasn't simply hiding a mistake anymore. He was escalating, trying to gain leverage through deception, maybe intimidation, maybe manipulation. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to improve. Fortunately for me, neither was his situation. Because while Mason was busy searching for ways to pressure me, he had no idea how much evidence already existed. And more importantly, he still believed he controlled the board. What he didn't know was that the trap was almost finished, and I had already scheduled a meeting that would change everything. The meeting was my idea. That was the part that confused Mason. People expect confrontation after betrayal, anger, threats, raised voices. What they don't expect is an invitation to breakfast, especially when that invitation comes from the person they just stole from. On Friday morning, I called him. The timing was deliberate, not too soon, not too late. Just enough time for uncertainty to grow. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad." His voice carried something new, hope. Hope can be surprisingly dangerous, because hope often convinces people they've escaped consequences. "I was thinking," I said, "about your situation." Silence. Then, "Okay. Meet me for breakfast tomorrow." Another pause, longer this time. "Breakfast. Goldie's, 9 o'clock. You want to talk?" "I do." That was all I said. No details, no explanations, no accusations. The less information people have, the more likely they are to fill in the blanks themselves. And human beings are remarkably good at creating the stories they want to believe. By Saturday morning, Mason had clearly convinced himself that things were going his way. I could see it immediately. Goldie's Breakfast Bistro sat busy as always. The smell of coffee, bacon, and pancakes filled the room. Servers moved between tables carrying plates the size of hubcaps. The familiar sounds of Boise weekend mornings echoed throughout the restaurant. Families, retirees, college students recovering from questionable Friday night decisions. Normal life. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. Investigators who arrive late don't stay investigators very long. I took a booth near the back. Good visibility, good acoustics. Not that I needed either. Again, old habits. At exactly 8:58, Mason walked in. His confidence arrived before he did. You know that look, the look someone wears when they believe they've solved a problem. Expensive navy jacket, polished shoes, fresh haircut, controlled smile. For the first time in weeks, he looked relaxed. That told me everything. He thought the house collateral conversation had worked. He thought I was considering helping. He thought breakfast represented progress. Poor kid. He slid into the booth. "Morning." "Morning." A waitress named Kelly appeared. She'd known me for years. "Usual twam." "Please." She looked at Mason. "What about you?" He ordered an omelet, extra bacon, orange juice. The confidence continued. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things. Weather, football, construction around downtown Boise. Nothing important, nothing threatening. I wanted him comfortable. Comfortable people talk. And talk. And talk. Eventually, he brought up the topic himself. I didn't even have to ask. "So have you thought about what we discussed?" There it was, the bait. I took a sip of coffee. Some. And I looked out the window for a moment, making him wait, not dramatically, just enough. "Tell me exactly how bad things are." The question hit harder than he expected, because truthful answers require commitment, and commitment was something Mason had been avoiding for weeks, maybe months. He looked down at the table, then away, then back. "I've had some setbacks." There it was, the professional version of a disaster. Setbacks, like he'd misplaced a pair of sunglasses, not potentially destroyed his financial future. I nodded. "How much?" He hesitated, then gave a number. $280,000. I nearly choked on my coffee, not because it surprised me, because it was worse than I expected. Much worse. The number hung between us. Heavy. Real. And for a brief moment, I saw the truth. Not the manipulator, not the liar, just my son, scared, exhausted, overwhelmed. That moment mattered, because villains in real life rarely see themselves as villains. Most people are simply trying to escape consequences, even when they choose terrible methods. "I got in too deep," he admitted quietly. The honesty sounded strange, like hearing a familiar song played in a different key. I nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question landed hard. His eyes dropped. No answer. Because there wasn't a good one. Not really. After a while, he shrugged. I thought I could fix it. There it was, pride, the same pride that ruins businesses, marriages, families, lives. The same pride that convinces people they can solve problems alone, even when evidence says otherwise. Our food arrived. For a few minutes, we ate quietly. Then something unexpected happened. A voice appeared behind me. Well, if it isn't the two most stubborn men in Idaho. Linda. Of course. I nearly laughed. Mason looked startled. Linda stood there carrying a coffee cup and wearing a bright red jacket. She smiled, completely innocent, completely unconvincing. You eating alone? I asked. She pointed toward a nearby booth. Meeting friends. She wasn't. I knew it. She knew I knew it, but nobody acknowledged it. The woman had somehow turned strategic eavesdropping into an art form. Mason forced a smile. Linda smiled back, then walked to a table where she absolutely intended to hear every word we said. Some people provide emotional support. Linda provided surveillance, and honestly, I appreciated both. Once she settled in, the conversation resumed. Mason became more confident again, too confident. That was the problem. Confidence often arrives right before mistakes. He began talking about future plans, business opportunities, investment recovery, expansion strategies. You would have thought he was presenting a TED Talk instead of discussing catastrophic debt. I listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking questions, mostly allowing him to reveal himself. That's something investigators learn early. Never interrupt a person who's volunteering information. Eventually, he said something important. Very important. If I can just get through the next few months, everything changes. Interesting. Everything changes. Not, I fix my mistakes. Not, I repay people. Everything changes. Different mindset. Different priorities. I stored that away. Another detail. Another puzzle piece. By the end of breakfast, Mason looked genuinely optimistic. More optimistic than I'd seen him in weeks, which meant he had completely misunderstood the purpose of the meeting. Perfect. Because the breakfast wasn't about negotiation, it was about observation. And observation had been successful, extremely successful. As we stood to leave, I finally delivered the line I'd been preparing. Let's meet with Rebecca Sloan. He blinked. My attorney. Your attorney? No, mine. A brief flash of concern crossed his face. Just a flash, then disappeared. What for? To discuss options. That answer was technically true. The best kind of true. The kind that leaves out important details. He relaxed immediately. Again. Poor kid. Okay. Monday afternoon. Works for me. We shook hands. A strange moment, because it felt almost normal. Almost. Then Mason walked toward the parking lot, and I watched him leave, watching a man who believed he was moving closer to victory. What he didn't know was that Rebecca Sloan already had copies of the video, the tracker records, the timeline, the mistaken text message, everything. By the time Monday arrived, the trap wouldn't merely be ready, it would be airtight, and Mason was walking straight toward it with a smile on his face. Monday arrived with clear skies over Boise, the kind of bright autumn morning that makes everything look peaceful, which felt ironic, because by 2 o'clock that afternoon, one of the most important conversations of my life was going to happen. I spent the morning doing ordinary things. Laundry, coffee, checking the mail, feeding the birds. The normal rhythm helped. It reminded me that life continues even when family problems try to consume all available space. Around noon, Linda stopped by. No baked goods this time. Apparently even she recognized the seriousness of the day. She stood on my porch holding 2 cups of coffee. One for herself, one for me. You nervous? She asked. I considered the question. A little. Angry. Less than I expected. She nodded. That made sense to her. It made sense to me, too. Anger is loud. Disappointment is quiet. And disappointment had been my primary companion for the past several weeks. Linda sat beside me on the porch swing. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said something I'll never forget. Whatever happens today, don't let his worst decision become the only thing you remember about him. I looked at her. That was such a Linda thing to say. Practical, compassionate, annoyingly wise. Because the truth was, I'd spent so much time gathering evidence that I'd almost forgotten the person behind it. The little boy who used to ride his bicycle in circles around this driveway. The teenager who stayed up all night helping me build a treehouse. The young man who cried at his mother's funeral. Those versions of Mason still existed somewhere. The problem was that they were buried beneath debt, pride, and fear. At 1:15 p.m., I drove downtown. Rebecca Sloan's office occupied the second floor of a brick building near Jefferson Street. Nothing flashy, just clean, professional, quiet. Rebecca had handled estate planning, property transfers, and legal matters for years. More importantly, she was smart, very smart. The kind of attorney who never wasted words. When I arrived, she was already waiting. A folder sat on the conference table. Several folders, actually. Neatly organized, color-coded, exactly the way I like things. "You look calm," she said. "I've had practice." She smiled. "Good." Then her expression became serious. "Everything is ready." I nodded, because everything was ready. The video, the tracker records, the neighbor camera footage, the timeline, the accidental text, storage facility information, photographs, screenshots, documentation. Months earlier, all of this would have felt excessive. Now it felt necessary. Ray Mitchell arrived 10 minutes later. He carried his usual travel mug. Black coffee, no nonsense, no small talk, just quiet support. And I appreciated that, more than I probably said. At exactly 1:58 p.m., Mason arrived. Right on time. Interesting. People often reveal their confidence through punctuality. Mason walked into the conference room wearing a navy blazer and gray slacks. Professional, polished, prepared. At least he thought he was prepared. He shook Rebecca's hand, nodded to Ray, then sat across from me. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The room felt strangely still, like the pause before a thunderstorm. Then Rebecca began. "Thank you all for coming." Professional, neutral, controlled. Mason leaned back in his chair. Comfortable. Confident. Still believing this meeting concerned financial assistance. Still believing he understood the situation. Rebecca opened a notebook. "Before we discuss options, I think it would be helpful to clarify the circumstances." Mason nodded. "Of course." Then she looked directly at him. "Can you explain your current financial situation?" The question seemed harmless. Mason answered willingly. "Business losses. Market conditions. Investor pressure. Temporary cash flow problems." I listened carefully, not because I needed information, because I wanted to hear what story he chose. That matters. The stories people tell often reveal more than the facts. For nearly 20 minutes he spoke, not continuously, but enough. Each explanation carefully positioned him as a victim of circumstances. Unfortunate timing, bad luck, market conditions, economic pressures. Not once did he mention responsibility. Not once. Interesting. Rebecca listened politely, occasionally taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Nothing confrontational, nothing aggressive, just enough rope. And Mason kept taking it. Then she asked another question. One simple question. "Have you taken any actions to secure assets or resources that might help resolve these issues?" The room became slightly quieter. Not noticeably, just enough. Mason hesitated, then shook his head. No. There it was, the lie. Direct, simple, documented. I watched Rebecca write something down. No reaction, no challenge, no accusation, just documentation. Again, more rope. The conversation continued. Mason discussed potential loans, future opportunities, business recovery plans. The entire time he remained confident, relaxed, optimistic. And that's what made the next moment so powerful. Because confidence disappears instantly when reality arrives. Eventually, Rebecca closed her notebook, folded her hands, and looked at me. "Cannon, is there anything you'd like to add?" I nodded slowly. This was it. The moment we'd been building toward. Not the climax, not yet, but the doorway leading there. I looked at Mason, really looked at him. For a second I saw the little boy again. The child who used to sit on my shoulders during 4th of July parades. The teenager who begged me to teach him how to drive. The young man who stood beside me at Evelyn's graveside. Then I saw the man sitting in front of me, and I asked a question. Only one. Mason. Yeah. Is there anything you want to tell me before we continue? The room went silent, completely silent. Mason frowned. What do you mean? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I waited. Sometimes silence is the most powerful question. People rush to fill it. Mason shifted in his chair, slightly uncomfortable now, for the first time all afternoon. I don't know what you're asking. Another opportunity, another chance. I was giving him one, maybe the last one. Is there anything you want to tell me? Again, simple, direct. No accusations, no evidence, no pressure, just an invitation. Tell the truth. For several seconds, he looked genuinely confused, then uncertain, then defensive, and finally, no. The word landed heavily, not because I expected a different answer, because I had hoped for one. Hope is stubborn that way. Even after disappointment, even after evidence, even after betrayal, a part of me still hoped my son would choose honesty. He didn't. Rebecca nodded slowly. Then she turned toward the laptop sitting on the conference table. The same laptop that contained everything. Every video, every image, every timestamp, every mistake. And as her hand moved toward the screen, something finally shifted inside Mason. Maybe instinct, maybe intuition, maybe guilt. Whatever it was, his confidence disappeared. For the first time since entering the room, he looked nervous, very nervous. Then Rebecca rotated the laptop toward him, and my son finally came face to face with the truth he thought nobody else had seen. The first thing Mason saw was himself. Not metaphorically, literally, frozen on the screen, standing on my front porch at 11:47 p.m. wearing a gray hoodie and work gloves, one hand gripping the side of my safe. The timestamp sat in the upper corner like a witness that couldn't be intimidated. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The room felt airless, silent, heavy. Mason stared at the screen, then blinked, then leaned forward, as if moving closer might somehow change what he was seeing. It didn't. Reality rarely does. Rebecca clicked play. The video began. There he was, frame by frame, minute by minute. No dramatic soundtrack, no narration, just truth. Mason and Ethan maneuvering the safe across my porch, loading it into the Silverado, driving away. Simple, clear, undeniable. When the video ended, Mason sat motionless. The confidence he'd carried into the office was gone. Completely gone. In its place sat something much more honest. Fear. I wish I could tell you I enjoyed seeing it. I didn't. That surprised me. For weeks I'd imagined this moment, the reveal, the confrontation, the justice. I thought it would feel satisfying. Instead it felt sad. Because victory against your own child isn't really victory. It's just evidence that something valuable broke. Finally Mason spoke. His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. Dad? Then nothing. No explanation. No excuse. Just that single word. Dad. The way he'd said it when he was 10 years old after breaking a window with a baseball. The way he'd said it after wrecking his first car. The way he'd said it at Evelyn's funeral. Dad. I looked at him, waiting, giving him space, giving him another chance. This time, he didn't take it. Instead, he looked away. Rebecca reached for another folder. There's more. Mason's head snapped toward her. The tracker records appeared next. Dates, times, locations. A detailed history showing the safe's movement from my house to the storage facility near Chinden Boulevard. The color drained from his face. Then came the photographs. Storage facility records, vehicle images, screenshots, the neighboring security footage. Every layer, every mistake, every breadcrumb he'd left behind. Ray remained silent throughout. Professional, calm, watching, the way retired cops do. Finally, Mason shook his head, slowly, almost in disbelief. You tracked the safe. I nodded. You put a tracker in it. Years ago. His eyes closed briefly. That hurt him more than the video, not because of the tracker itself, because it revealed something important. He hadn't understood me nearly as well as he thought he did. For weeks, he'd assumed he was manipulating an old, retired man. Instead, he'd been trying to outplay someone who spent 30 years investigating theft cases. That realization landed hard. Then Rebecca opened another file. The text message. The accidental one. The room grew even quieter. She read it aloud. "If he won't cooperate, we'll have to pressure him harder." Every word hung in the air. Mason stared at the table, no longer denying, no longer arguing, no longer pretending, just sitting there with the consequences. Finally, I asked the question I'd been carrying for weeks. Why? Simple. One word. The most important word in the room. Mason didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice cracked. Not dramatically, just enough. I didn't know what else to do. I believed him. That's the strange part. After all the lies, I actually believed that sentence, because desperation had been driving this entire disaster. Not evil, not hatred, desperation, mixed with pride, mixed with fear, mixed with greed. A terrible combination. "I was drowning," he said quietly. "I know. I thought if I could get access to the property records." His voice faded. I finished the sentence for him. "You thought there was money in the safe." He nodded, ashamed. "You thought there was something that could save you." Another nod. Silence followed, long silence, the kind that forces people to sit with themselves. Eventually, Rebecca spoke, professional as always. "Cannon has several options." Mason didn't look up. "I know." "No," she said. "I don't think you do." Then she outlined them. Everyone. Criminal charges, civil action, financial recovery, property claims, documentation, evidence preservation, all perfectly legitimate, all entirely possible. And as she spoke, I watched Mason realize how serious the situation truly was. This wasn't a family argument anymore. This was evidence. Recorded evidence, documented evidence, legal evidence. The distinction mattered. By the end, he looked exhausted, completely exhausted. Then Rebecca finished, and the room became quiet again. Everyone looked at me, waiting, because ultimately the decision belonged to me, not Rebecca, not Ray, not the police, me. I took a deep breath, then another, and thought about Evelyn. Funny how often she appeared in moments like this. I imagined what she would have wanted, not what she would have tolerated, what she would have wanted. There was a difference. Finally, I looked directly at my son. "Mason," he raised his eyes, red, tired, defeated. "I'm not sending you to jail." His shoulders dropped instantly. Relief, massive relief. But I wasn't finished. That doesn't mean there won't be consequences. The relief faded. Good. It needed to. Because forgiveness without accountability isn't forgiveness. It's permission. And I wasn't interested in permission. I laid out the conditions. The safe would be returned immediately. Everything inside would be verified. All storage costs would be reimbursed. All access keys surrendered. A legally binding repayment agreement would be signed. Financial counseling, debt disclosure, full transparency. No more secrets, no more games, no more lies. Each condition landed heavily, but he accepted everyone, without argument, without negotiation. Because for the first time in weeks, reality had finally defeated pride. Then something unexpected happened. Mason looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw tears, not dramatic tears, not movie tears, the kind people spend enormous energy trying not to show. "I'm sorry, Dad." There it was, the sentence I'd been waiting to hear, the sentence that should have come weeks earlier, months earlier, maybe before any of this happened. I believed that too. At least partly. The apology was real. The damage was real too. Both things can exist at the same time. That's one of the hardest lessons adulthood teaches. Eventually, the meeting ended. Documents remained. Consequences remained. Work remained. But the confrontation was over. As Mason left the room, he looked smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. like a man carrying the full weight of his own choices. The door closed behind him. Silence returned. Rebecca gathered her papers. Ray finished his coffee, and I sat there staring at the empty chair my son had occupied. The evidence had won. The truth had won. Justice had won. But sitting there in that quiet conference room, I realized something important. Getting justice wasn't the same as getting my son back, and that realization followed me all the way home. The safe came home on Wednesday. 3 men from a local moving company rolled it carefully back into my office at exactly 10:23 in the morning. I remember the time because old investigators notice things like that, and because I'd spent nearly 3 weeks staring at an empty corner of the room. Now the corner looked normal again, or at least as normal as it could. The movers positioned the safe exactly where it had stood before. The indentations in the carpet lined up perfectly. The dust outline disappeared. The room looked restored. Funny thing is, appearances can be misleading. The safe was back. The trust wasn't. Those are very different things. After the movers left, I stood alone in the office for several minutes, just looking at it. Gray steel, scratches from transportation, a few new dents along one side. Physical evidence of a bad decision, kind of like the family itself. Eventually, I entered the combination. The lock clicked. The heavy door opened, and for the first time since everything happened, I exhaled. Inside, everything appeared intact. Folders, documents, external drives, photographs, boxes. Nothing obvious was missing. I checked slowly, methodically, one shelf at a time, one folder at a time, the way I'd conducted investigations for decades. Then I found the letters, Evelyn's letters, still stacked neatly inside their blue storage box. Untouched. I sat down in my office chair and stared at them. You know, throughout this whole ordeal, I kept telling myself the letters mattered most. And they did. But sitting there holding them again, I realized something else. The letters had never actually been in danger. Not really. Because Evelyn's words lived inside me long before they lived inside paper. The safe had protected the letters. Life had protected the memories. That's a different thing entirely. I opened one, not because I needed to, because I wanted to. The envelope simply said, "For difficult days. Trust Evelyn to leave instructions that remained useful years later." Inside was a handwritten note, short, simple, exactly the way she communicated best. One sentence immediately caught my attention. Canon people are often at their worst when they're most afraid. I laughed. Then I cried a little. Not dramatically, just enough. Because sometimes the people we lose continue helping us anyway, even years later, especially years later. That evening, Linda arrived carrying a large pot of chicken soup. Of course she did. Some people send text messages. Linda delivered carbohydrates. She walked inside without knocking. Another long-standing tradition. How's the safe? Back. How's your son? That question was harder, much harder. I thought about it for a moment, then shrugged. I don't know, because I didn't. Not really. The legal agreements had been signed. The repayment structure existed. Financial disclosures had begun. The storage unit was emptied. Everything practical had been addressed. But relationships aren't practical. That's the problem. You can't repair trust with paperwork. You can't rebuild confidence through signatures. You can't notarize forgiveness. If lawyers could fix families, the world would look very different. Linda sat at the kitchen table. I served soup. We ate quietly for a while. Then she asked something important. Do you think he'll recover? Again. A difficult question. Financially? Probably. Mason was smart, hardworking, capable. Emotionally, I wasn't sure, because consequences change people. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not. I hope so, I finally said. Linda nodded. Me too. A week passed, then another. Life gradually resumed its rhythm. Morning coffee, bird feeders, trips to Goldie's, football games. Normal things. The kind of ordinary moments that eventually return after chaos. Ray checked in occasionally. Rebecca handled remaining paperwork. Everything moved forward. Slowly. Steadily. And then one evening, just after sunset, my phone buzzed. A text message. From Mason. The first direct message since the meeting. I stared at it for a while before opening it. Not because I was afraid, because I wasn't sure what I wanted to feel. Eventually, I tapped the screen. The message contained only 3 sentences, no excuses, no explanations, no requests, just 3 sentences. I've started financial counseling. A pause. Then, you were right about more things than I wanted to admit. And finally, I'm sorry for who I became. That last sentence stayed with me. Not what I did, not what happened, who I became. There was honesty in that wording, real honesty, the kind that usually arrives only after consequences. I read the message 3 times, then set the phone down, and didn't answer. Not immediately. Some stories end with instant reconciliation, a dramatic hug, tears, forgiveness. Credits roll. Everybody learns a lesson. Real life rarely works that way. Real life moves slower. Trust returns in inches, not miles. Sometimes people need to prove they've changed before words mean anything. Sometimes healing requires time. Sometimes silence is part of recovery. That night I sat on the porch. The same porch where the camera had recorded everything. The same porch where I'd spent countless evenings with Evelyn. The same porch where Linda regularly appeared carrying baked goods and unsolicited wisdom. The autumn air felt cool, comfortable, peaceful. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about evidence, or trackers, or storage units, or legal documents. I was thinking about family, the complicated kind, the imperfect kind, the real kind. And I realized something. The story wasn't actually about a stolen safe. Not really. The safe was just the vehicle. The real story was about choices, pride, fear, trust, and the consequences that follow all of them. Mason had made terrible choices. That was true. But he wasn't the worst thing he'd ever done. None of us are. Thank God for that. Because if people could only be measured by their worst moment, every single one of us would lose, including me. Especially me. As darkness settled across the neighborhood, I picked up my phone again, opened the message, looked at it one more time, then typed 4 simple words. "We'll talk soon, Dad." Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Just a door. A small one. Cracked open slightly. Enough room for hope. And sometimes that's all a family gets. Sometimes that's enough. Life teaches strange lessons. One of the hardest is that trust can take decades to build and only minutes to break. The people closest to us have the greatest ability to help us, but they also have the greatest ability to hurt us. That doesn't mean we stop loving them. It means we learn the difference between love and blind trust. I also learned that understanding someone's pain doesn't excuse their behavior. You can have compassion for someone's struggles while still holding them accountable for their choices. In fact, real accountability is often one of the most compassionate things you can offer. And maybe the biggest lesson of all is this. When people are drowning, pride often keeps them from asking for help until it's too late. If you're struggling, talk to someone. Ask for help before desperation starts making decisions for you. If this story meant something to you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation like this? We read every single one. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.